The dawn sky over Harmony Valley was painted in shades of crimson that seemed prophetic as Benjamin McKinnon saddled his horse and prepared for another day of watching the eastern boundary of his family's ranch. For 3 generations, the McKinnon family had maintained an armed vigil against their neighbors, the Callahans, in a blood feud that had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. Benjamin was 22 years old, tall and lean, with the sun-weathered face of a man who had spent his entire life working the harsh Wyoming rangeland. His hands, calloused from years of rope work and gunplay, moved with practiced efficiency as he checked his Winchester rifle and adjusted the Colt 45 that never left his side. Like every McKinnon man before him, Benjamin had been raised to view the Callahans as mortal enemies whose very existence was a threat to his family's survival. The feud had begun in 1847 when Benjamin's grandfather, Sean McKinnon, and Patrick Callahan had arrived in Harmony Valley within days of each other, both laying claim to the same water rights along Clearwater Creek. What should have been a simple territorial dispute had escalated into violence when Patrick's brother Michael was found shot dead near the disputed creek, and Sean McKinnon was accused of the murder despite his protests of innocence. The Callahans had retaliated by burning down the McKinnon homestead, killing Sean's wife and youngest son in the process. From that moment forward, the two families had been locked in a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that had consumed 3 generations of young men on both sides of the valley. Benjamin's own father, Robert McKinnon, had died 5 years earlier in an ambush that everyone believed was orchestrated by Connor Callahan, the current patriarch of the enemy clan. The attack had left Benjamin as the head of the McKinnon family, responsible for protecting his mother, his younger sister Sarah, and the ranch that represented everything his family had fought and died to build. As Benjamin rode toward the eastern pasture where their prize breeding bulls grazed, he could see smoke rising from the Callahan ranch house across the valley. The sight filled him with the familiar mixture of anger and wariness that had been his constant companion since childhood. Every Callahan was a potential killer, every shadow might hide an enemy rifle, and every day brought new opportunities for the ancient hatred to claim more victims. The boundary between the 2 ranches was marked by a line of cottonwood trees that followed the path of Clearwater Creek, the same water source that had sparked the original conflict decades earlier. Benjamin had ridden this patrol route countless times, always alert for signs of Callahan trespass or sabotage. But today, something felt different about the familiar landscape. As he approached the creek, Benjamin noticed fresh horse tracks in the soft earth near the water's edge. The prints were small and delicate, suggesting a young rider on a light horse rather than one of the hardened ranch hands that both families employed. More puzzling still, the tracks seemed to wander aimlessly along the creek bank, rather than following any purposeful route. Benjamin dismounted to examine the tracks more closely, his trained eye reading the story they told. The horse had been moving slowly, stopping frequently to allow its rider to dismount and walk around. There were small footprints in the mud, clearly made by someone wearing delicate shoes rather than the heavy boots that were standard equipment for ranch work. Following the trail upstream, Benjamin discovered something that made his blood run cold. A cluster of wildflowers that had been carefully picked and arranged into a small bouquet, left beside the creek as if in memorial or offering. No McKinnon would have left flowers on disputed ground, which meant that a Callahan had been here, possibly scouting for weaknesses in the McKinnon defenses. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused Benjamin to leap behind the cover of a large cottonwood, his rifle ready for action. Through the morning mist that rose from the creek, he could see a lone rider approaching from the Callahan side of the valley. The figure was small and moved with a grace that suggested youth. But Benjamin had learned never to underestimate an enemy based on appearances alone. As the rider drew closer, Benjamin realized with shock that this was not one of the hardened Callahan men he had been expecting. The approaching horseman was actually a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, with auburn hair that caught the morning sunlight like spun copper. She wore a simple blue dress that marked her as someone unaccustomed to ranch work, and her seat on the horse suggested more genteel riding experience than the practical horsemanship needed for cattle work. Benjamin had never seen this woman before, but her presence on Callahan land left no doubt about her identity. This had to be Connor Callahan's daughter, the girl who had been sent away to finishing school in Denver years earlier and was rumored to have recently returned to help her widowed father manage the ranch. The young woman dismounted near the creek and began picking wildflowers with obvious pleasure, humming a soft melody that carried across the water with haunting beauty. She seemed completely unaware of Benjamin's presence or of the danger she was courting by venturing so close to McKinnon territory. Benjamin found himself mesmerized by the scene, watching as the Callahan girl moved with unconscious grace among the flowers that grew wild along the creek bank. There was something almost ethereal about her presence in this place of ancient hatred, as if she existed in a world where the blood feud held no power and enemies could admire wildflowers in peace. The spell was broken when the girl's horse, startled by something Benjamin couldn't identify, reared and broke free from its tether. The animal galloped away toward the Callahan ranch, leaving the young woman stranded on what was technically McKinnon land with no way to return home safely. Benjamin watched from his hiding place as the girl realized her predicament, her earlier serenity replaced by obvious concern as she looked around the empty valley for help that would not come from her own family. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be for Benjamin to remain hidden and let her solve her own problem. Getting involved would only create complications that could escalate the feud to new levels of violence. But as he watched the Callahan girl standing alone beside the creek where so much blood had been spilled over the decades, Benjamin found himself making a decision that would have horrified his ancestors and enraged his surviving family members. Stepping out from behind the cottonwood with his hands clearly visible and his rifle pointed at the ground, Benjamin called out in a voice he hoped sounded more confident than he felt, "Miss, are you in need of assistance?" The young woman spun toward him with startled surprise, her hand moving instinctively to her throat as she recognized the danger of her situation. Benjamin could see her mind working, calculating whether this strange man represented rescue or a threat greater than being stranded alone in the wilderness. "You're a McKinnon," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her green eyes. "Yes, Mom," Benjamin replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that felt natural despite everything he had been taught about treating Callahans as enemies. "Benjamin McKinnon, and you would be Connor Callahan's daughter, I'm guessing." "Catherine Callahan," she confirmed, lifting her chin with a pride that reminded Benjamin powerfully of his own stubborn family. "I suppose you're going to hold me for ransom or use me as some kind of bargaining chip against my father." The suggestion hit Benjamin like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of what 3 generations of hatred had created. This beautiful, intelligent young woman expected him to behave like a monster because that was what Callahans had been taught about McKinnons for as long as anyone could remember. "Miss Callahan," Benjamin said carefully, "I'm going to help you get home safely, and then we're both going to pretend this encounter never happened. The last thing either of our families needs is more reasons for bloodshed." 3 weeks had passed since Benjamin McKinnon's first encounter with Catherine Callahan beside Clearwater Creek, and the young rancher found himself thinking about the Callahan girl far more often than wisdom or family loyalty should have allowed. Her grace, her intelligence, and most surprisingly, her lack of hatred toward his family had challenged everything Benjamin had been taught to believe about their enemies. Despite his promise that they would pretend their meeting had never occurred, Benjamin discovered that he could not forget the sound of Catherine's laughter when he had helped her catch her runaway horse, or the way her green eyes had sparkled with curiosity when she asked him about the wildflowers that grew along the creek. For the first time in his life, Benjamin had met a Callahan who seemed more interested in beauty than bloodshed. The responsible thing would have been to report the incident to his mother and sister, warning them that Connor Callahan's daughter was back from Denver and might pose some kind of threat to their security. Instead, Benjamin found himself riding the creek boundary every day, hoping for another glimpse of the young woman who had disrupted his understanding of the world. His vigilance was rewarded on a Thursday morning when he spotted Catherine's familiar figure walking along the creek bank, this time on foot and carrying what appeared to be a small wicker basket. She moved with the same unconscious grace that had captivated him during their first meeting, stopping occasionally to examine something of interest along the water's edge. Benjamin dismounted and approached cautiously, unsure of how Catherine would react to seeing him again. Their previous encounter had been accidental and brief. Seeking her out deliberately crossed lines that had been drawn in blood generations before his birth. "Miss Callahan," Benjamin called softly as he drew near. "Good morning." Catherine turned toward him with a smile that made Benjamin's heart skip several beats. "Mr. McKinnon, I was hoping I might see you again." The admission sent shockwaves through Benjamin's carefully constructed worldview. No Callahan should be hoping to see a McKinnon, just as no McKinnon should be feeling the surge of joy that Catherine's words created in his chest. "I've been gathering medicinal herbs," Catherine explained, holding up her basket to show an impressive collection of plants that Benjamin recognized from his grandmother's old remedies. "My father has been suffering from joint pain, and the doctors in town don't seem to understand how to treat someone who's spent his whole life working cattle." Benjamin found himself studying Catherine's face as she spoke, noting the genuine concern for her father's welfare and the intelligence that guided her amateur botanical pursuits. This was not the cold, calculating enemy that McKinnon family law had prepared him to expect. "My grandmother used to make a tea from willow bark for joint pain," Benjamin found himself saying. "There's a grove of willows about a quarter-mile upstream where the bark is particularly potent." Catherine's eyes lit up with interest and gratitude. "Would you show me? I'd be very grateful for any knowledge that might help ease his suffering." The request created a moment of internal conflict for Benjamin that was more intense than any physical battle he had ever fought. Helping a Callahan, even with something as innocent as herbal medicine, represented a betrayal of everything his family stood for. Yet the alternative, refusing to help someone who was suffering, seemed to violate even more fundamental principles about human decency. "I suppose there's no harm in sharing grandmother's remedies," Benjamin said finally, leading Catherine toward the willow grove that had been a source of natural medicine for both families over the decades. As they walked together along the creek bank, Benjamin found himself drawn into conversation that ranged far beyond herbal medicine. Catherine had indeed spent 4 years in Denver, attending a finishing school that had exposed her to literature, music, and ideas that were rarely encountered in the isolated cattle country of Wyoming Territory. "I studied the history of territorial disputes during my time in school," Catherine said as they gathered willow bark together. "It's remarkable how often conflicts that begin over practical matters like water rights or grazing land evolve into personal vendettas that outlive the original participants by generations." Benjamin paused in his work, struck by the academic perspective Catherine brought to their family's blood feud. "Are you saying that our fathers and grandfathers might have been fighting over issues that no longer matter?" "I'm saying that young people don't have to inherit the hatred of their elders," Catherine replied, her voice carrying a conviction that made Benjamin's pulse quicken. "Every generation has the opportunity to choose whether they want to perpetuate old conflicts or build something new and better." The radical nature of Catherine's suggestion should have alarmed Benjamin, but instead, he found himself intrigued by the possibility that decades of violence and suspicion might not be inevitable. What if peace were actually possible between the McKinnons and Callahans? What if the next generation could focus on building rather than destroying? Miss Callahan, Benjamin said carefully, if someone were theoretically interested in exploring the possibility of peace between our families, how would such a process begin? Catherine's smile was radiant as she realized that Benjamin was seriously considering alternatives to the ancient hatred that had defined both their lives. I think it would begin with two people who were willing to see each other as human beings rather than symbols of old grievances. The afternoon passed quickly as Benjamin and Catherine shared stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their growing frustration with the limitations that the family feud imposed on their lives. Benjamin learned that Catherine had always wondered about the McKinnon family, curious about the people her father described as mortal enemies, but whom she had never actually encountered. I used to climb to the top of our barn loft and look across the valley at your ranch house, Catherine admitted. I wondered what kind of people lived there, whether they were really as terrible as Father claimed, and why no one ever seemed interested in finding peaceful solutions to our problems. Benjamin felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he realized that Catherine had been thinking about his family with the same curiosity that had always made him wonder about life on the Callahan Ranch. I did the same thing, he confessed. Watched your house through my father's telescope and wondered if Callahans were really the monsters we'd been told they were. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, both young people realized that their clandestine meeting would have to end soon. The longer they remained together, the greater the risk that someone from either family would discover their forbidden friendship and escalate the feud to new levels of violence. Will I see you again? Catherine asked as they prepared to part ways. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both understood perfectly. Continuing to meet would require deception and risk that could easily prove fatal if discovered. Yet the alternative, returning to lives of isolation and inherited hatred, seemed increasingly unbearable. Tomorrow, Benjamin said, surprising himself with his decisiveness. Same time, same place. Catherine's smile was worth any risk as she nodded her agreement. Tomorrow, she confirmed. As Benjamin watched Catherine walk back toward Callahan territory, he realized that his world had fundamentally changed in the span of a single afternoon. The enemy had become a friend, hatred had been replaced by fascination, and the rigid certainties that had guided his life were crumbling like old foundations under the pressure of new possibilities. That evening, as Benjamin sat at the dinner table with his mother and sister, he found it almost impossible to maintain normal conversation. Every word felt like a potential betrayal of the secret he now carried, and every casual mention of the Callahans made him acutely aware of how much his perspective had shifted. Benjamin, his mother, Margaret McKinnon, said during a lull in the conversation, "You seem distracted tonight. Is everything all right with the boundary patrol?" "Everything's fine, Mother," Benjamin replied, hoping his voice sounded more convincing than it felt. "Just thinking about ranch business." His sister Sarah, who was only 16 but possessed the sharp intelligence that ran in the McKinnon bloodline, studied her brother's face with obvious suspicion. "You've been acting strange for weeks, Benjamin. Almost like you've got some kind of secret you're not sharing with your family." The observation hit closer to the truth than Benjamin was comfortable acknowledging, but he managed to deflect Sarah's curiosity with jokes about the burden of being the man of the family. Inside, however, he was beginning to realize that keeping his friendship with Catherine Callahan hidden would be far more difficult than he had initially imagined. A forbidden friendship blooms between enemies. But how long can Benjamin and Catherine keep their secret meetings hidden from their feuding families? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how this dangerous romance unfolds. The autumn moon hung full and bright over Harmony Valley as Benjamin McKinnon made his way through the shadows toward the Cottonwood Grove, where he had been meeting Catherine Callahan for the past 2 months. What had begun as chance encounters had evolved into carefully planned meetings that had become the highlight of both their lives. Despite the enormous risks involved, tonight felt different, charged with an electricity that seemed to crackle in the crisp air. Catherine had sent word through their elaborate system of hidden messages that she had something important to discuss, something that couldn't wait for their usual afternoon meetings by the creek. Benjamin's heart raced as he considered the possibilities, ranging from wonderful to terrifying. The grove was illuminated by moonlight filtering through the nearly bare branches of the cottonwoods, creating a cathedral-like space that seemed designed for clandestine romance. Catherine was already there when Benjamin arrived, her silhouette graceful against the silver-touched landscape as she waited beneath the largest tree. "Catherine," Benjamin whispered as he approached, using her given name for the first time since their friendship had begun. "You said it was urgent." She turned toward him with an expression that mixed joy and fear in equal measure. "Benjamin, I couldn't wait any longer to tell you. I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Benjamin like lightning, confirming feelings that he had been trying to deny for weeks but could no longer ignore. The daughter of his family's greatest enemy had become the most important person in his world, and the impossible had become inevitable. "Catherine," Benjamin said, moving closer until he could see the moonlight reflected in her green eyes. "I stopped trying to fight these feelings weeks ago. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." Their first kiss was tender and desperate, two young people reaching for happiness across a chasm of inherited hatred that had seemed unbridgeable just months earlier. In that moment, surrounded by the natural beauty of the valley that both families claimed as their own, Benjamin and Catherine created something new and precious that transcended the ancient boundaries of the feud. "What are we going to do?" Catherine asked when they finally broke apart. "Our families will never accept this. They'd rather see us both dead than together." Benjamin took her hands in his, feeling the warmth and strength that had drawn him to her from their very first meeting. "We're going to find a way to make them understand that love is stronger than hatred. We're going to prove that peace is possible." Even as he spoke the words, Benjamin knew they were easier said than accomplished. 3 generations of blood and betrayal couldn't be erased by young love, no matter how pure or determined. But looking into Catherine's eyes, seeing the hope and courage that matched his own, Benjamin found himself believing that miracles might indeed be possible. Their romantic interlude was shattered by the sound of multiple horses approaching the grove at high speed. Benjamin's blood turned to ice as he realized that their secret meetings had somehow been discovered, and that the moment of reckoning they had both dreaded was about to arrive. "Benjamin, get away from that Callahan witch." The voice belonged to his sister, Sarah, and it carried a fury that Benjamin had never heard from her before. Emerging from the shadows came a group of riders from both families, their faces grim in the moonlight, and their hands resting on weapons that had ended too many lives over the decades. Benjamin recognized his mother, Margaret, and Sarah, along with several McKinnon ranch hands. Facing them across the grove were Connor Callahan himself, his sons Patrick and Michael, and an equal number of armed Callahan men. "So it's true," Connor Callahan said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute betrayal. "My own daughter, consorting with McKinnon scum like some kind of common harlot." Catherine lifted her chin with the pride that Benjamin had come to love, refusing to be intimidated even by her own father's rage. "Father, if you'll just listen, I can explain. Benjamin is not what you've been told. None of them are what we've been told." "Explain?" Connor's voice rose to a roar that echoed across the valley. "Explain how you've been sneaking around with the son of the man who murdered your uncle. Explain how you've betrayed everything our family has fought and died for." Margaret McKinnon's voice was equally fierce as she addressed her son. "Benjamin, step away from that girl right now. Have you lost your mind completely? Have you forgotten what the Callahans did to your father?" Benjamin felt the weight of history pressing down on him like a physical force. 3 generations of hatred and violence demanding that he choose sides in a conflict that had defined his entire existence. But looking at Catherine, seeing the pain and determination in her eyes, he made the choice that would either heal or destroy both families. "Mother," Benjamin said, his voice carrying across the grove with surprising strength. "I love her, and she loves me. That's not a betrayal of our family. It's a chance for both our families to finally find peace." The admission sent shockwaves through both groups of armed men, hands moving toward weapons as the implications of Benjamin's words sank in. This was no longer a simple case of youthful rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the fundamental assumptions that had guided both clans for decades. Patrick Callahan, Connor's eldest son, drew his pistol with obvious intent. "You McKinnon bastard, you've corrupted my sister for the last time." But before anyone could fire the shots that would have started a massacre, Catherine stepped between the two groups with her arms spread wide, making herself a human shield between the feuding families. "Stop!" she cried, her voice carrying across the grove with desperate authority. "Look at yourselves. Look what this hatred has made you become. You're ready to kill your own children, rather than admit that love might be stronger than revenge." The power of Catherine's intervention froze both groups in place, forcing them to confront the reality of what they were about to do. Here was an innocent young woman, willing to sacrifice her own life to prevent more bloodshed between families that had already lost too much to violence. "Please," Catherine continued, tears streaming down her face, but her voice growing stronger with each word. "Benjamin and I have spent months getting to know each other, really know each other, not the monsters you've all imagined your enemies to be. He's kind, intelligent, and honorable, just like I know many of you are, on both sides." Benjamin moved to stand beside Catherine, taking her hand in a gesture that was both protective and symbolic. "She's right," he said, looking directly at his mother and then at Connor Callahan. "We've been so focused on hating each other that we've forgotten how to be human beings." For a long moment, the grove was silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the nearly bare branches of the cottonwood trees. Two young people stood hand in hand in the moonlight, surrounded by the armed representatives of families that had been killing each other for half a century, asking for something that seemed impossible, the chance to love each other in peace. Connor Callahan was the first to speak, his voice heavy with the weight of years and loss. "Do you have any idea what you're asking? Your families have been blood enemies since before you were born. Good men have died because of this feud." "Yes, sir," Benjamin replied respectfully. "And good men will continue to die unless someone has the courage to say that enough is enough. Catherine and I want to be those someones." Margaret McKinnon lowered her weapon, studying the young couple with eyes that seemed to be seeing them clearly for the first time. "Benjamin, even if what you're saying is true, how can we trust them? How do we know this isn't some elaborate Callahan trick?" It was Catherine who answered, her voice carrying the sincerity that had first attracted Benjamin to her months earlier. "Mrs. McKinnon, I give you my word as Connor Callahan's daughter that I love your son with all my heart. I would rather die than see him harmed, and I believe he feels the same way about me." "I do," Benjamin confirmed, squeezing Catherine's hand as he looked around the grove at the faces of people who would determine their fate. "More than that, we want our love to be the beginning of peace between our families. We want our children to grow up without this hatred poisoning their lives." And the mention of potential grandchildren seemed to impact both patriarchs in ways that arguments about peace and forgiveness had not. Connor and Margaret exchanged a look across the grove that held decades of shared experience with loss and the hope that the next generation might find better solutions than violence. "If we were to consider this," Connor said slowly, "there would have to be guarantees, assurances that past grievances would be forgotten and that both families would commit to peaceful coexistence." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "A formal agreement, witnessed by the territorial authorities, something that would make this peace legally binding for both families." Benjamin felt his heart soaring as he realized that the impossible was actually becoming possible. The love that he and Catherine shared had somehow cracked the foundation of hatred that had seemed so permanent and unshakable. "Yes," Catherine said, her voice bright with hope and joy. "Whatever you need us to do, whatever guarantees you require, we'll provide them. All we ask is the chance to prove that love really can conquer hate." As the two families began the delicate process of negotiating peace after generations of war, Benjamin and Catherine remained hand in hand beneath the cottonwood trees where their forbidden love had bloomed into something powerful enough to change the world around them. The blood feud that had defined Harmony Valley for 50 years was ending not with more violence, but with a young couple's determination to choose love over hatred, hope over despair, and peace over the endless cycle of revenge that had claimed too many lives already. What an incredible ending! Love truly conquered generations of hatred. Benjamin and Catherine's courage to stand together changed everything. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of love triumphing over conflict in the Old West. Share this powerful story with everyone who believes in the transformative power of love. What was your favorite moment in this journey from hatred to healing? Let us know in the comments below.